and we are speaking about democracy in halacha. The truth is, we're not talking about democracy in halacha. There is some democracy does play a role in halacha, and perhaps we'll talk about that at the end of this year for just a couple of minutes. But the emphasis, the truth is, we're not really discussing democracy in halacha. What we're really discussing is the concept of when many people have an opinion versus a few or one person that has an opinion. Is there halachically more importance to the many than to the few? But to call it democracy is not fair. Okay? So just begin with a story. The story is with Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz is famous for his feud with Rabbi Yaakov Emden, very difficult part of Jewish history to understand from a couple hundred years ago. They, I believe, accused each other of being Shabtai Tzvi followers. But be that as it may, that's for a different night. The story is told about Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz that he was asked by a non-Jew, why do the Jewish people not follow after Yashka, after Jesus Christ? After all, aren't the Christians the majority? Doesn't the Torah itself say, Achrei Rabim Lahatos? Doesn't the Torah itself say that you should go with the majority? So Rabbi Yonasan answered him that the principle of going with the majority is only when you have a question of suffix. It's only when there's an issue of doubt. However, we who are not faced with any doubt when it comes to our religion, when it comes to our faith, so there's no reason to go with the majority who are mistaken. That was his response to the non-Jew in that particular moment. That's a story, a small story about an interaction between a Gadol B'Yisrael, between Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz and boy, Clark, can I come with you there?
Yeah, where is he?
Oh.
Clark, he had a background on.
Okay. The sugya that we started talking about last week, I told you a story about the oven last week, didn't I?
The oven, yes.
If you're the only one who remembers, Andy, I'm going to have to tell a story again.
Uh-oh.
I'm sure everyone, and we do have a few new people on, so I'll just share it without all the drama, just a brief version of the story, if you will. The story goes like this. There's a tanur of Achnai. The Achnai was a snake-like oven. And the question was, as I mentioned last week, if you have a particular kind of a vessel that's made from cheres, made from clay, and it contracts tumah, which is a certain kind of spiritual impurity, the halacha is it's not like a metal pot that you just bring into the mikvah. It's not like a metal pot which you just bring to the mikvah, but rather you actually have to break it and rebuild it. And the question was whether or not this particular oven was breakable and rebuildable or not. And Rabbi Eliezer was arguing with the rabbis. And Rabbi Eliezer said that I believe he held it was tahor. I believe he held it could be broken apart and rebuilt. And he said, if I'm correct, allow this carob tree to prove that I'm right. And immediately the carob tree was uprooted. It's like something out of science fiction, something that you would see on Disney. And it was uprooted and placed either 100 amos or 400 amos, either 200 feet or 800 feet away. And they said to him, what are you bringing your proof from a carob tree? A carob tree is a carob tree. A carob tree is not a rabbi. We don't care about what he has to say. And then he said to them, well, if I'm right, let this spring of water prove that I'm correct. Because I guess they were camped or they were sitting near some spring of water. And the spring of water, instead of flowing from north to south, immediately reversed direction and went from south to north, and miraculously. And they said to Eliezer, what are you bringing a proof from a spring of water? A spring of water doesn't get to have an opinion. Obviously, he was bringing miracles to prove that God was on his side, and his response always was, their response always was, you can't bring proofs from a miracle. So then he said, if I'm correct, let the walls of the Beis Medrash prove that I'm correct. And immediately the walls of the Beis Medrash began to collapse. Rabbi Yeshua, who was one of the opposing rabbis here, says to the walls that in Talmidei Chachamim shel Menachem zeh zeh b'halacha, you have Talmidei Chachamim who are fighting with each other halacha. Atem ativchem, what are you getting involved for? So they refused to fall because of out of the respect for Rabbi Yeshua, on the one hand, And they also refused to go back up because out of respect to Rabbi Eliezer on the other hand. And apparently they're still standing there together like a teepee. Okay? So Rabbi Eliezer says, "Im halacha kemosi, the halacha is like me min hashamayim yochichu." Let the heavens prove that I'm correct. Immediately a baskol is a heavenly voice, came out and says, "Why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? We always hold like Rabbi Eliezer." Rabbi Yeshua, so in other words, Hashem himself, in a sense, testified that Rabbi Eliezer is correct. So then Rabbi Yeshua gets up on his feet and he says, "Lo b'shamayim hi." We don't have to listen to you, Hashem. We don't have to listen to heavenly voices, because once Hashem gave us the Torah, right? Barry didn't. Did you lay it? You didn't lay it for us this year, Barry. Mitzvah zos, asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. This mitzvah, this Torah that I'm giving you today, lo nifleisi yimcha v'lo rechoki. It's not something that's so awesome and so distant. Lo b'shamayim hi. It's not in the heavens. Kikar ve'elecha hadavar miyod. It's very close to you. Neficha b'vavcha, in your own mind, in your own heart, in your own mouth, to do it and to say it. What does it mean, lo b'shamayim? That Hashem gave us His Torah already, and therefore when He gave us the Torah, as we'll soon see a little bit further on in this year, He gave it to us, and it's not up to Him anymore. And since in the Torah it says, in the Torah itself, it gave us the principle of acher rabbim lahatos, that you go with a majority. Therefore, the halacha is with the rabbim, with the majority of the rabbis, of the chachamim, and not like Rabbi Eliezer. In the continuation of the Gemara over there, on page 59b in Bava Metzia, the Gemara there tells that one of these rabbis, I guess, met up with Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, and he saw him, I guess, in the street somewhere, and he asked him, "Tell me, what was Hashem doing at this time when we had this argument?" And he said, "Chiyech, Hashem was smiling. V'amar nitzchuni banai. My children have vanquished me. My children have defeated me." Okay. So this is one, I guess, sort of famous. There's one sort of famous Gemara that's related to the concept of Yachid v'Rab, Malacha Kerabim, that when you have a majority and you have a individual or even a minority, so the halacha is going to be like the majority. Any questions so far? I believe I shared the Gemara with you last time.
But does it matter? Different people have different status, different learning, and what have you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which word to use in this case, but does that matter to the principle that you just enunciated?
Very good question. Thank you for the segue. That's an excellent segue.
Excuse me, Rabbi, by the way, you referred to this story, but you didn't go into any details.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad I wasn't repetitively redundant. Okay.
Good one.
Not incredibly.
You're on mute, Rabbi.
I know, it was on purpose. I had to tell myself.
It's a tough crowd.
No. You don't understand. My whatever. It's a long story, but I'm not sure if I've used that line more or the drinking twice line more. When you say l'chaim, I mean, if anyone in the Mechila is keeping track. Okay, so we have a Gemara. The Gemara is in Yevamos. It's on page 14a, and it's a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara is discussing something which I'm not going to go into in detail. In terms of, it has something to do with Yibum. I'm not sure who not included. I ask you to please mute yourself. But the Gemara is discussing something that has to do with an aspect of Yibum, of Levirate marriage. The point that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the two schools of thought, the two yeshivas were arguing about, is not material to the discussion. Okay? And it's not important. What's important is that we understand that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai allowed a certain type of marriage to take place, and Beit Hillel prohibited this practice. Okay? And it seems that there were two different traditions that were followed. So the Gemara asks, or Rish Lakish asks, do you hold that Beit Shammai actually acted in accordance with their own statement? He opines that Beit Shammai did not, in fact, act in accordance with their own statement, as the dispute was merely theoretical. In other words, imagine Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai arguing about whether or not a certain kind of marriage is permitted. Beit Shammai says it is. Beit Hillel says it's not. Now, if that was the case, and the couple got married like that, so then Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai's yeshiva students would never be able to marry each other's sisters, because according to Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai's, some of those people are, I don't know if they're Amzerim, or exactly what their halachic status would be, but they certainly would be problematic. So the Gemara then says that that there's a discussion between Rav and Shmuel as well. Did Beit Shammai actually act in accordance with their own statement or not? Shmuel says, no, they actually did. So then the Gemara goes into detail, because it's an obvious question that comes up. We know, you all know, I believe it's a Gemara in Eruvin. We had it in the Daf Yomi a couple months ago, that speaks about why it is that we paskin like Beit Hillel. It's actually a fascinating Gemara on why we hold like Beit Hillel and not like Beit Shammai. Okay, and the Gemara there talks about the advantages that Beit Hillel had over Beit Shammai. But the Gemara is going to speak about a specific example or specific aspect of the relationship here, which we'll soon see. So the Gemara inquires, when does this question apply? So if we say, and the conclusion of the Gemara in Eruvin is that the reason why we paskin like Beit Hillel is because of the Bas Kol. There was a heavenly voice that came out that said that you should go with Beit Hillel and not with Beit Shammai. And we know that throughout Shas, Hillel and Shammai, I believe, only argue 3 times in Shas. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai argue many times in Shas, in the dozens of times throughout the Talmud. And the halacha is always, I think there's a couple of exceptions, but basically almost all the time follows Beit Hillel and not Beit Shammai. So the Gemara inquires, when does the question apply? If we say that it's referring to the period prior to the Bat Kol, a Bat Kol again is a divine voice that declared that the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. So then why would Shmuel say that Beit Shammai did not act? Why would Rav argue? Because again, if we're discussing prior to the Bat Kol, so of course Beit Shammai went with their own opinion. They didn't have to listen to Beit Hillel because there was no divine voice telling us the halacha goes with Beit Hillel. But if you're going to say that it refers to after the divine voice, so what's the reason for the one who said they did act in accordance with their opinion? After all, the halacha is established in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. So the Gemara answers that neither of these options poses a difficulty. But if you want to say that it's referring to prior to the divine voice, then it's referring to the period when Beit Hillel formed the majority of the sages. And therefore, to the one who said that Beit Shammai did not act in accordance with their opinion, the reason would be because Beit Hillel was the majority and halacha is in accordance with the majority. And the one who said that they did act in accordance with their opinion maintains that when do we follow the majority? It's only in a case, and Greg, here's where your question comes up, it's only in a case where the disputing parties are equal in wisdom to one another. Here, the Gemara says, Beit Shammai mechadid ditfei, which means Beit Shammai is sharper than Beit Hillel. And therefore, even though they're the minority, they acted in accordance with their own opinion because they were at a higher level than Beit Shammai.
And Beit Hillel.
Excuse me, than Beit Hillel. Yes, good. So that's the shakla v'tarya. That's the give and take of the Gemara over here. There's different kinds of perspectives. What comes out though is that on the one hand, you have this principle of acher rabim lahatos, which is that you go with the majority. On the other hand, you certainly see a possibility that if the minority is kind of a brighter, sharper, of a higher status, however, whatever you want to call it, so then the halacha is going to be going with those opinions rather than the opinion of that says that you go with the majority. So there's a very interesting question here, which is kind of an obvious sort of a question. We just learned in Bava Metzia with the Tanur of Achanoi that the halacha is you do not listen to a divine voice. Torah lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in the heavens, Hashem gave it to us. So we just learned that. And then we also learned the Gemara in Eruvin that tells us that Beit Hillel is that we do go with Beit Hillel and not Beit Shammai. And who told us that? The same divine voice. And in Shas, it's generally accepted that, in the Talmud, it's generally accepted that we go with Beit Hillel. And why is that? Because of this divine voice. Hold on, you have a contradiction. On the one hand, you have the Gemara in Bava Metzia that says, Eid mashkichin b'Bas Kol, lo b'shamayim, we don't pay any attention to a divine voice. On the other hand, you have the Gemara in Eruvin, which clearly seems to assume that we go with the Bas Kol. And here you see the Gemara in Yevamos, it definitely goes with that. So how do we answer that question? So I was speaking this over with my cousin, Rabbi Azriel Brown, and he wanted to say, and he said that Rav Kolevsky, my Rosh Yeshiva Zatzal, whose yahrzeit is coming up, I believe it's the 9th day of Kislev. I was very, very close to him, actually. I mentioned him many times in the past in Shul. And so they both shared a similar kind of idea, which is like this. Let's say you have a conflict here, and this is the question that Greg was asking. On the one hand, you have a rove, okay? Let's call it 5 people, okay? On the other hand, you have 2 people. But the 2 people are mechadid itzfei, okay? The people are very, very, very sharp. So let's use an analogy here. We go, when questions of substance, difficult questions were brought up, and the regular, folks, the regular rabbis didn't know the answers, they would bring the question to the Sanhedrin. Well, what happens if in the Sanhedrin there was disagreement? Well, obviously you're going to have to go with the same principle. You always go with the majority. Well, what happens if in the Sanhedrin the minority opinion was stronger because those particular rabbis were known to be, quote unquote, bigger rabbis, right? They were more scholarly, maybe they were older, they were sharper, whatever it might be. So do you listen to the Sanhedrin? Do you go with the principle of the rove, of the majority of the people, or do you go with the principle of mechadid itzfei, the fact that these people are sharper? So the answer is that in a Sanhedrin, even though it's true you have a range of possibility amongst the justices with regard to how sharp they are, but they're all in the same ballpark. And if they're all in the same ballpark, so therefore we don't view the minority as being mechadid itzfei. We don't view the minority as being particularly sharper. And therefore, going back to our Gemara here, Beit Shammai, at least according to one answer in our Gemara, Beit Shammai said, look, we are mechadid itzfei, we're sharper. And there are enough of us who are sharper than Beit Hillel, and therefore their majority doesn't count. Beit Hillel says, no, we are the majority, and therefore the halacha is like us. So what does this mean? So here you have an argument, and we don't know the answer. And it's not an argument about who the halacha is like or is not like. This is a halacha of Beit Shammai seems to have a legitimate claim that they are the ones who are sharper, even though they're in the minority. And Beit Hillel says, no, you're not that much sharper than us. We're still in the same ballpark as you. Comes along the bas kol, comes along the heavenly voice. And the Gemara in Eruvin, that's, as we say in Yeshiva, it's mevar the mitzias, which means that it clarifies for us what the reality is. And what is the reality? The reality is that Beis Hillel, even though it's true that perhaps Beis Shammai is a little bit brighter, a little bit sharper, but it's not like they're playing a different game. They're still in the same ballpark. And that's why we listen to that particular bas kol. As opposed to when it came to the issue of the tanur v'chanoi, the oven in Bava Metzia, so there you had people who were all in the same ballpark, and you had a majority, and you had an individual, and the halacha is going to go with the majority. And the fact that the divine voice said one way or another makes no difference to us, because obviously the halacha is going to follow the principle of acher rabim lahatos. How's that for clarity to your question? To answer your question, yes, it makes a difference, but if they're all in the same ballpark, even though they're slightly sharper, then it does not necessarily matter. Okay, there's a very important Ramban in Chumash, which I've taught in other classes in a different context. But the Ramban says something very, very interesting, and the Ramban in his Hasagos of Sefer HaMitzvos, in his commentary to the Rambam's counting of the mitzvos, says something very, very similar. He says like this: the Torah was given to us through Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, that which was written down. And obviously new scenarios are going to arise in terms of technology and other instances that are not necessarily spelled out in the Torah itself. And Hashem gave us a halacha. The halacha is in Parsha Shoftim that you have to go to the Sanhedrin HaGadol, you go to the Beis Din HaGadol to listen to the halacha. And whether or not that halacha was something that they figured out on their own, or whether it's something that they understood on their own, or whether it's something that was handed down to them in transmission from Moshe himself, he says, Al mashma'u shelahem hu mitzaveh v'nosin lana Torah. Hashem gave us the Torah within the framework of the Chachamim. And that is that even if the Chachamim, and I believe he writes this, even if the Chachamim quote unquote get it wrong, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that that's what the Chachamim said. And since that's the system that Hashem created, and that's what Hashem himself is quote unquote limiting himself to it, and therefore the halacha is going to follow the majority. The Ran, in his drashos, writes something similar, and he says, actually, we don't need to quote it. It's not going to add so much. Okay. I want to share one more story from a Tosefta in Brachos that also just kind of speaks to this theme, to this principle. It's also a very interesting story. Ma'aseh Rabbi Gamliel, a story happened with Rabbi Gamliel, the Zakanim, and the elders. So Rabbi Gamliel and the elders, they were sitting in a city called Jericho. Haviu lefneim kosavos. They brought them dates, and they ate the dates. And v'nasan Rabbi Gamliel reshus levarich. Rabbi Gamliel gave permission to them. He said, okay, whoever wants to make the afterbracha for everybody, go ahead. Rabbi Akiva jumped up, and he made ala eitz, valprio eitz. So the Gemara calls a bracha achas mein shalosh. Amala Rabbi Gamliel, Akiva malacha, ata machnes roshcha ben machlokes. So Rabbi Gamliel says to Rabbi Akiva, of course he called him Akiva. He says, what are you doing? Why are you entering yourself? Literally, why are you putting your head, sticking your head into the argument? Amalo, he said to him, what do you mean? So what do you mean? You told us. Rebbe, you yourself taught us the principle of going with the majority. Even though you may say one thing, and your friends say like this, the law is like the words of the majority. So here too we see kind of an instance, an example of where where one of the rabbis themselves kind of resorts to the principle in order to justify his behavior. Okay, so what we've accomplished so far tonight is first of all, it's interesting, but just a couple of different cases from Chazal where we see the principle in action, where maybe the principle is threatened by other kinds of rules, or like Greg's question about what if they're sharper, and kind of where you see a couple novel thoughts in terms of how you resolve those sorts of questions. That's what we've seen until now with regard to the principle of going with the majority.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
It sounds like a very subjective way of approaching things. The minority is going to say one of two things. It's going to say, that's baloney, we're just as bright as they are. Or it's going to say, okay, maybe they're brighter than us in general, but in this specific case, they are not brighter than us. So it sounds like a very difficult system to work one way through.
Right, which is why I think the only thing that resolved it in terms of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, that was maybe what they were arguing about, was the divine voice in that particular case. I don't know that there's other places in Shas where you come across this kind of a scenario. I don't believe so. It's kind of pretty unique to say that the halacha is like a particular group. We have individuals who are known to be so outstanding that the halacha is generally like them when they argue against other individuals. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov is one of the people who we go according to his opinion when he argues against an individual. So there you have a concept of where the individual person is quote unquote rated, but he's rated by his peers. He's not rated by us, or even by later generations. He's rated by his peers. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let's take a look at the reason for the halacha. This is from the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch explains that. We saw a little bit of this last week, perhaps, but it's important, I think, to elaborate on. So the Sefer HaChinuch says like this: "B'nosef lahanacha, shedas harov notel emes yoser midas hamiyut." He says that I'm not sure if he's saying it's like a social psychological observation that if you put 15 people in a room and you have some paint on the wall that's an ambiguous color, well, I may consider it ambiguous, but my wife would say it's not ambiguous. Okay? So for me, it's ambiguous, but they're all going to say, no, it's not ambiguous. It's blue or it's brown or it's red or whatever it is, right? So most of the people are going to get it right. The concept that most of the people are going to get it right most of the time. What does Bob Katz say? You can please most of the people some of the time, but something like that. But don't try to please them all of them all the time. Okay? So he says that we need to have it. We need to have a system. He's explaining the need for a system. He says without a system, it'll just be like the Wild West. Everybody just does what they think is correct, and they won't take into consideration the what other people are thinking. He says Tasahat Torah kechama Toros. I believe there's a Ramban who writes this as well on why it is a mitzvah of listening to the rabbis. He says because if there's no mitzvah, if Hashem himself didn't give us a mitzvah to listen to the sages of the generation, speaking specifically about generations of the Sanhedrin, etc., says the result would be chaos because people that would have a question and wonder what to do, they'd come up with something on their own, and the resulting practice wouldn't just be okay. Nowadays, it's true we have different practices. You have Ashkenazi and Sephardi, etc. But imagine he says you'd have thousands of different practices. You would lose the religion. You wouldn't be able to transmit anything. Because each person would say, Dati no senes, in my opinion, Amita Sa'inyan, that so-and-so got it right, and everybody else get it wrong. But then, of course, everyone's going to argue about that kind of a point. He says, a churban, a destruction will come out from that sort of an approach. And therefore the Torah tells us that we need to follow the words of the Chachamim. And again, even within that, you have a system so that you have some sort of resolution. This concept of rov, I want to share a point of lumdus, a point of analysis with you that is, till now that what we've been learning is more or less kind of 101. I want to take it up a notch, if you will, to 102 or even 103 over here for a moment.
If I can ask you a question at some point.
Yeah, let me just say this point and then you'll ask. Is that okay? All right. The reason I want to do that is because I have a deadline of 9:15, so I want to share this point and then we'll have some time for questions. There's a halacha called chazaka. Chazaka is the assumed position. I don't know if that's the best translation, but it's the given position. It's the position that something exists. Okay. Let me see if I can explain a little bit better. There's something called chazaka meikara. What's chazaka meikara? A woman was married until now. So she has what's called a chazkas eishes ish, which is that she has a chazaka that she's married. So therefore, if somebody, let's say her husband throws her a get, and there's a doubt about whether the get was closer to him or closer to her. If the get was closer to him, she's still married to him because it's not hers. If the get is closer to her, so then she is divorced. Nowadays, we don't do gittin like that. You actually have to put it into her hand, okay? But back in the day, they had different ways of doing gittin, different ways of transferring the ownership of the get. So if we have a doubt as to whether the woman is divorced, so then the chazaka meikara tells you that she is married to her husband. Does that make sense?
Right.
Now, what is the understanding of that chazaka? Is that a birur? Is that anhaga? Birur means that you know for a fact, you have a suffix, you have a doubt, is she married or divorced? And now you've established the answer to that doubt. She is still married. Now, don't forget, there was a case of where he threw the get to her, and there was a question, was it closer to him or closer to her? If you know for a fact it's closer to him, then she's not divorced. Closer to her for a fact, she is divorced. You have a doubt, is it closer to him or closer to her? So then you don't know. And therefore you go with the chazaka meikar. She has a chazaka that she's an eshes ish, that she's married. And the halacha is, since she was married until now, we assume she's still married. Basically, we assume that she's still married. So what kind of chazaka is that? Is that a chazaka that tells you the reality? Or is that just what the practice because you don't have a better option? Follow? With me?
Yes.
Okay. Clark, am I making sense? Good. So that's pardon me?
It's the second
one. Correct. It's anhaga, not beer. Correct. Because it's not beer, because we still don't know if it was closer to him or closer to her. So it's just a practice. Very good. That's right, Barry. But let's say you have something which the Torah tells us called Eidim, witnesses. The Eidim come along, and they say that Reuven killed Shimon. Okay? So Reuven killed Shimon. Now, the Torah tells us that the level of proof that's required in the Torah is that you need two witnesses. Maybe one witness is reliable. In American courts, one witness is reliable. Maybe yes, maybe no. But the Torah says no, you need two witnesses. Maybe you'll argue two witnesses are not reliable because maybe they can collude with each other, even though we have a system to try to prevent that. Maybe really you need 8 witnesses. No, you can't say that because the Torah says you need 2. So that's exeris hakosov. The Torah tells us that 2 witnesses is good enough. But what the Torah is essentially telling us, and maybe this is a chiddush, maybe it's novel, but is that that level of birur, that level of clarity is enough. So in that case, in the case of the Eidim, in the case of the witnesses, it's not just a practice of, I'm not really sure, did Reuven kill Shimon or not? And the Eidim said he did, and therefore we're going to just go with this sort of assumption. No, it's not an assumption, it's a fact. Is it really a fact? No, but it's a usable fact. I'm not sure if I'm sure there are better English words to say this. Is it an absolute fact or is it a subjective fact? Right? The answer is no, it's not an absolute fact. But since the Torah says it's true, therefore it's a fact. Right? In other words, we have our system. Does that make sense? So here you have, on the one hand, in the case of the woman who was married, now you're not sure if she's married. So you're using a chazaka, which is an haga, which just tells you how to act. And on the other hand, you have the case of the Eidim, which creates birur, which creates, quote unquote, a fact. So now the question is, what is rov? Does rov tell you that something is, that it's like chazaka, that you go with it, but doesn't really give you the fact? Or is rov, or is the idea of going with the majority, hold on, Herb, telling you like a chiddush? And the chiddush of the pasuk is that, the chiddush of the pasuk is that it is in fact a fact. And that's something that the Achronim discuss, just in terms of how do we understand the idea of achirabim lahatos. That is a question about rov in general. When it comes to, when you have many sages against one sage, there is no real discussion. I think everybody agrees over there that it is considered to be a birur, which is basically a fact. Obviously, there's a lot more here. There's much more here. Rov is something that we can talk about for many, many nights. But these are some ideas that I wanted to share with you, just to give you a sense of a little bit of the history, a little bit of the complexity, a little bit of some of the ideas in terms of, just appreciating the system of Torah. And although as I said before, this has nothing really to do with democracy. I will mention one point about democracy, but let me just take a couple of questions first. Jerry, you had a question.
Yeah, Robert, the question I had was, are there any situations where the rov doesn't account, doesn't hold? In other words, where the basis for a position is not with the rov is not as powerful, it's not as strong. It doesn't have a mishnah or a brayta or something to substantiate it versus the other position.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that it's a generational question, meaning that the question of rov is against your peers. But if the other person was able, let's say the minority was able to bring a proof. Let's say you have 5 Amoraim one way and the one Amoraim the other way, and he brought a proof from a Tana, so that would certainly be stronger. The only other thing I'll add is that in certain cases of reality, let's say you have 10 stores, 9 of them sell treif meat, and one of them sells kosher meat. Okay, and you find a piece of meat on the road, is it kosher or is it treif? So you say called the parish miruba parish, okay? That if it's separated, then you assume it's from the rove. But if you find it on the store, but in certain cases you can say no, you don't go with that principle. It's pretty complicated, okay, over there. But maybe in that kind of a case, one of those sorts of cases, we'll have an example of where you do go with the minority, even in the presence of a majority. Herb, you had a question?
Yeah, two things. One is in American law, there's something called a rebuttable presumption, means that's assumed to be the case, but you can prove it wrong. And there's a conclusive presumption. So that seems like they're counterparts, where even if, despite the evidence, it's considered binding. For example, if a child was born during the marriage, it's even if you had proof to the contrary, it's considered the child of the husband and wife.
Okay, what was the second kind of presumption you said? Conclusive?
Conclusive and rebuttable presumption.
Okay, interesting. I'll check it out.
Okay, the other question I had was sometimes we say that a minhag is too difficult for a community to follow.
Yeah.
So we discard it. How does that work?
So there's something called a gzeira she'ein hatzibur yachad lamed bo, which I think is what you're referring to, which is when, let's say, Chazal made a decree, but it was something that the community wasn't able to do it. So what's an example of that? Maybe
Sleeping in the sukkah?
no. No, it's a good guess because of all the arguments about it. But
There was one that had to do with nocturnal emissions, and that you had to go to the mikvah. There was something like that, something with women maybe, and that it was just too much. They just couldn't keep constantly going to the mikvah. Something like that.
yeah, no, Takanas Ezra, in terms of why Takanas Ezra didn't stick, I don't think that's the reason why. I think it's more like non-Jewish bread from a non-Jewish bakery, paspalter. Initially, they said, if I'm not mistaken, they said it should be something which is prohibited, but it didn't stick. As opposed to Chalav Yisrael, which did stick, or I think oil did not stick. Yeah, so that's I think that's what you're referring to. So it's a little bit different than, we're discarding it, but it never took root. In those cases, it never took root. And that's why. I just want to mention one last thing, and then I have to run, which actually has to do with perhaps a source in the Talmud for the idea of democracy. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but maybe it's a good study for us, a good topic for us to study, and that is a very famous Rashbam. Rashbam was Rashi's grandson. I think it stands for Rabbi Shimon ben Meir, and his commentary in Bava Basra on page 54b. He writes that the king's authority regarding Dina de Malchusa Dina derives from the consent of the people. In other words, we're all familiar with Dina de Malchusa Dina, the law of the land is the law. Where does the king gain the authority to determine the law? The answer is it derives from the consent of the people. Now, if it's true in the king's authority, certainly it's true in terms of the way that we pass laws in our country, right? It's certainly true in a democracy, that the consent of the people is essentially, we have our representatives, and they're the ones who write the law, and of course it has to be ratified by the other house and by the president, etc. There's a whole system of checks and balances. You all know, are much more expert in it than I am. So the idea that the Rashbam is referring to is that the halacha of Dina de Malchusa Dina is rooted in the consent of the people, and that certainly is something that sounds a lot like democracy. So there you actually have a halacha that is much more connected to democracy than the halacha that we have been discussing, which is basically comparing and contrasting a little bit the idea of Chirabim Lahatos, where you go with the majority. So that's certainly something that we can explore further. I'll tell you, by the way, this halacha has a lot of relevance. Why? Because there's discussion. Should we move back into the shul or not? And I don't want to mention any names or embarrass anybody, okay? But I was told in no uncertain terms on Shabbos, Rabbi, it's illegal. You're not wrong. It is illegal. But does that make it usher? Okay.
Rabbi, is there a
There
prayer?
you go with the Rov.
So there you go, the Rove, huh? Yeah, well, the Rove Democrats or Republicans. But the point is that
You go with the minion.
you go with the main, right? Yeah, exactly. So. Anyways, the point is that, and then, by the way, I'm not saying we should do something illegal, but the point of law is just because it's illegal doesn't make it prohibited according to halacha or not. And that's one of the questions being discussed today. It's very relevant.
I talked to Rabbi Yisraeli about that,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and I think his opinion is it's not usher.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Because many say that the rules of the law of the land are limited to financial matters and things of that nature that are meant to, protect society. But this is maybe something different, possibly. It's a longer discussion. I have to run. I apologize for that. But we'll definitely could explore it. Okay.
What's your answer to Herb's question that sometimes the law bends in accordance with the popular will? It's just too difficult.
Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, that's only when it doesn't take root.
Hasn't become established.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, meaning that even in the same generation that it was established, it wasn't accepted. It's not that 3 generations later they decided to do away with it.
Rabbi, is there a prayer class next Sunday? I have it on.
No,
Yeah.
not next Sunday. Next Sunday I have a conflict, so we're not meeting next Sunday. It's the following Sunday. I believe it's the 29th.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay.
Okay. All right, everybody. Laila Tov, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, very much.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Very good.
Thank you.